competition, we have DJ Dreamy and Dreamer. I'm now called this house order and call on the debaters to make the following motion. This house would. We are missing. Oh, who snuck out?
Yeah.
The strategy of going to the bathroom right when it's about to begin. Dodgy.
You would know.
Oh. Motion to be debated is this House believes that international sporting events should only be held in developed countries.
Yeah.
Again, returns. 5 minutes will get a speech not to exceed 7 minutes.
Can you run?
Call upon the Prime Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, what we on site opening government has a problem is when countries like underdeveloped or developing, such as countries like Brazil, hold the World Cup, the reason that there was backlash from the people itself wasn't even accorded to the basic health rights, right? We see that the main reason that these people backlash was because these people didn't have clean water, or they weren't given proper facilities, they didn't have proper hospitals or healthcare, they didn't have any safety or security, right? We believe that it's unfair for these countries to put the World Cup as the #1 priority over the people on the ground, right? These lives in particular are in such horrible circumstances, especially the secluded poorer areas that don't really have as many benefits as people in developed countries, right? We don't think that it's right for the state to #1 siphon a lot of money from us towards this World Cup, which is a one-time thing which cannot benefit you for such a long time, right? We also think, like, we give you an example, when Brazil built 15 huge stadiums for about 15 billion for the only reason to hold the World Cup once, we believe that it's unfair for these countries to use so much money when they could have used it towards the people on the ground, right? We see that that it didn't exist before and they won't be able to be used again. Sit down. The second thing that we have a problem with is that they clear the land. When they clear the land to make their buildings, first of all, it costs so much money to take down all the forests or take down whatever infrastructure was there. But on the other hand, people will view that place could have been a hospital for me or could have given me a job for my place, which I can benefit from. This stadium doesn't benefit me in the long term, right? That we don't think that it's fair. Sit down. Our side, what we stand for is the feasibility of this country, of the money to be properly distributed towards people on the ground for them to benefit. Sit down, I'll take you after this, right? Afterwards. But here's the thing, why do we think the developed countries should be able to do it? #1, we think that they have the capacity to do it, meaning that they have enough money, that people on the ground have safety and all the basic rights, meaning that they can focus on other things to begin with, right? But on the second thing, which is what my deputy is probably going to talk about, right, is that the people that in these developed countries, they don't face backlash. The backlash that can stop this World Cup from running smoothly or anything. We believe that these developed countries have the people on the ground in these developed countries are okay with having this World Cup there because of the only reason that I am already safe, I have proper jobs, and we are stable in the economy, right? Before I move on to my chief substantive, yes.
If Brazil looks on to the World Cup as a source of income, or a spiritual company, everyone has children there and do not give them the opportunity for them to vote.
Okay, so basically this is going to be opening government's speech, right? The harms of when you do it and why it doesn't benefit the people on the ground, right? Look, the main reason why we think that they shouldn't be able to is because of 3 reasons, which are my arguments. #1, it's unfair of the state to accord to secondary issues that may harm the people on the ground. #2, there's no actual tangible benefit in the end. And #3, how it harms the individuals on the ground, right? The first argument on how it's unfair to the state to accord to to prioritize World Cup over other people, right? Because we see that the state, this is what we're going to prove. that the state has the capability and the capacity to get so much money, to get so many sponsorships, to bid that for the thing, to build so many stadiums, to spend so much money on it. They do have the capacity to do it. But what are they doing now? They're not solving poverty. They're not giving jobs. They're not building infrastructure, even though they have the capacity to do it. What they are doing right now is doing so many things and with so much money, right? We don't think that it's fair. It shows that the state does have the capability and has the capacity to make people's lives even better on the ground. Sit down. It's unfair for the state to help secondary utility like a sporting event as the primary goal of what they are doing, right? We think it's against every single principle of the ground, which is we're supposed to protect our people, make sure they're safe, make sure they're comfortable, and make sure they actually have stable jobs and economy, right? What they're doing right now is going against the state. So why is this backlash, right? Because the people on the ground see that you do have the capability of helping me. I am jobless. It's okay. You don't have enough money. That's what happens. But when you have the ability to hold the World Cup, when you have so much money to spend, that's when people get pissed because of the only reason that you're not according to me, you're according to a World Cup. Why are you doing this when you should be helping me get out of my poverty, right? Sit down. On the second argument, how there's no actual tangible benefit, because this is what they might be saying, that there are going to be benefits out of the World Cup. We don't think so, right? Because first of all, during the process before the World Cup, where you build so many stadiums, the thing is you don't prioritize the people on the ground, meaning that you don't care about people. You put them on a lower pedestal, and you putting up 15 stadiums and making sure tourists have a safe flight on your number one priority. Therefore, we don't see any benefit towards these people, right? But we see, here's the thing, right? We need to balance out two things. When you get the World Cup, you have to spend so much money, number one on making the World Cups, on the opening ceremony, on the closing ceremony, hiring Shakira and people to sing for you, and having to clear the land in the first place, right? There is so much money on the ground. But here's the thing, right? Do you actually get enough money for having people fly over to you? We don't think it necessarily balances out. But even if it balances out, we still don't think it's necessary at all. Because in the end, the people on the ground still don't get enough money that they want, and they don't get the ultimate benefit in the end. Okay, and yeah, basically that. And also, right, even like it's still their status, right? We don't think that you change the perception to Brazil whatsoever. Because people view Brazil as a poor country, then they say, okay, Brazil's holding World Cup, let's go to there. Then when they go out, they'll still view Brazil as the same status, right? We don't think all because of going there, you change the perception. But if even worse, maybe under their paradigm, they might think that Brazil isn't good of a country. Maybe they think that Brazil has so much poverty, it's so dirty. Then you have a bad image upon Brazil, right? We don't think that that's necessarily a good thing as a whole, and we don't think we should let this occur to people. Third argument on how it harms individuals on the ground. Because here's the thing, right? When you siphon the money towards these stadiums, it doesn't benefit the people on the ground. These people, if they want to play football in the stadium, fine, whatever. But it doesn't actually help these people live out their lives, get stable jobs, or get stable utilities, right? We don't think that they can benefit whatsoever. When you forget the people on the ground, you see that that's when you neglect them, you don't provide them proper amenities, and you disregard them as a whole, right? But here's what's the World Cup. But now they suffer even more after the World Cup, post-World Cup. Because now, all that money that you guys spend because normally after holding a World Cup, you suffer a loss, right? You suffer a loss of money and the deficit of money. So that even makes it harder for these people to take care of the people on the ground. And we don't think that these 15 stadiums will be beneficial at all. Because if you build a building or a hospital, it will help these people forever. If you build the stadiums, then the stadiums are just going to stadium over there or just stay there and just take out land on the people where they could be used as hospitals or they could be used to protect the people on the ground or help ensure their security, right? We give you the example of South Africa. After they hosted the World Cup, they lost the money and they couldn't care for the people on the ground. They didn't make any profit whatsoever, and we see that it's unfair towards the people on the ground to suffer when they didn't even consent towards it, and they didn't even get the choice to see whether we want the World Cup to be held with us or not. It provides instability. All the harms that are given to you about all the medical stuff will be amplified under their paradigm after the World Cup. We don't think these people should have to face these consequences, go beside opening government.
When the World Cup or international sporting events become the only avenue for developing countries to increase their influx, to increase their only avenue, side government takes away it, and we tell you that that's unjustified on few levels of analysis. But before I move on, few rebuttals. Do you actually cause social backlash? Because here's how they try to argue on how they take away educational rights and things like that. However, when you don't even give them the chance to regain back their money through tourism, through increase of ticket price, you harm them even more because you never gave them the chance in the first place. You never provided them the right that they rightfully deserve. And moving on to how they say there isn't any tangible benefit. And I'll prove to you in my substantive that they actually are. So first level of analysis, like what are the rights of these countries? What are the rights of these developing countries to do so? Firstly, these rights of these developing countries, they can do anything as long as there's a greater benefit to it and there isn't any third-party harm. So this policy restricts the country to do what they need to improve their country, to do what Brazil's children want to improve their country. So unless there's a third-party harm, then only you can restrict their right. So is there actually a third-party harm? We tell you maybe in the short term, but the long-term benefit is better because when the money comes back, you don't even give that money to come back in the first place. When the money comes back, when the increase of ticket pricing, we tell you that that's better in the long run, and there isn't an actual third-party harm. And moving on to my next, under my analysis is how the fans will still enjoy the game, how the value of the sports will still be there, and help people come to them, enjoy this. That's why tourism are improved, because in your worst case scenario is the quality of the tournament isn't achieved. But we tell you that doesn't matter because the fans still enjoy it, because that's how you get money, because that's how when people come to your country to get that money, we tell you that that's justified. So is their trade-off actually justified? Because we tell you that no, it's unprincipally justified to limit the freedom of a country to get that benefit as long as you don't hurt anybody. So in the conclusion to that, we tell you that it's principally unjustified for you to disallow a nation from excelling and limiting the rights of themselves. So before I move on, yes.
The only benefit you can get from this white element stadium. How does that have a direct benefit?
Okay, sir, so you clearly haven't listening to my speech where I talk about how tourism and these kinds of things, they will get back the money. Please start listening. So my second level of substantive is how you hinder the development of developing countries. So what are the nature of these developing countries? Countries such as Brazil and South Africa, who have hosted the World Cup, they have no money, right? And how these children depended, they trained and they wanted to become a football star because that is their only avenue to become. So when you take away that, right, when you don't let them host this, what will happen? Because the only reason they wanted to do it is to get out of their economic crisis. It's illogical to think that they wanted to host the World Cup to lose more money. We tell them that isn't what the country wants, because they want what's best for their children, and they want what's best for their children. So what happens now when you take away that, right? How you hinder development of developing countries? We tell you that the only avenue to get money, the only avenue to get even more money will be diminished. So the effect on the people will be even worse under your paradigm, because these people will suffer even more because they never had the chance to get back the money. They were never given the chance to give the money. For example, how Brazilian children who always wanted to train to be a football star, ever since young, because they believe that this is their only benefit. For example, how one of the Brazilian stars, right? These are people who previously lived in slums, but now they were good because they trained for football. Now, when you take that away, when you don't allow these developing countries to host that nation, we tell you it's selfish. Sit down. So what are the harms to this, right? Because what are the harms to developed countries actually hosting? Because these developed countries, they're already rich. Do they actually need the money? Because when they get their excessive amount of money, they monopolize everything. They never gave the developing countries a chance. We tell you that that's harmful because you hinder the development that you wanted. You hinder the development of the developing countries to actually go. So how it harms the developed country also is because now when you monopolize this, when the selfish developed countries, when you monopolize the sports, when you monopolize the value of sports, we tell you that that's harmful because you don't allow the other benefits to be for the developing countries to be achieved. And before I move on, yes, last one.
What's best for the children of Brazil is that when the government gives them money for education, instead of using all the money that they ever have on the stadium, tell us why is it more beneficial under yourself? When the children don't even need education.
Sir, then you have to tell us how are you going to get. You're just trying to say don't host the World Cup, but you never actually told us how are you going to get. So assuming that the moment you don't host the World Cup, the budget will go back to education, the budget will go back to the healthcare. We don't think, because if the government is really corrupted under your stance, they will still be corrupted anyway. So we tell you that under our stance, you actually provide the better stance. You actually provide, sit down, sirs. You actually provide a better stance by allowing the money to flow back, allowing the money to circulate back into the economy of these states, right? So you don't, so you allow these developing countries to rise up from the boom bust. So you allow these countries to rise up and tell that these countries that they have the potential to host, and when they actually have the capacity to do it, why not let them do it? Because when you don't even give them a chance, you hinder the development, and you make these people suffer even more. We tell you that that's harmful. So finally, on why this is harmful for developing countries as a whole, because now we told you that how they won't even have actual money to begin with, because the reason why the benefit is when you host a World Cup, when you have that money, when the government controls the pricing of the tickets, when you increase that money, and when people want to watch, because many people around the world will want to watch the World Cup. So it doesn't matter. So it's even more beneficial when you host it in a developing country, because they need the avenue, they need the resources to improve their infrastructure. Under our side, we do that even better, right? Because their side, they only told us that, take away the World Cup, the money will go back to them. They never actually proved to us how, and there isn't any transparency. And secondly, on how the people will suffer even more in developing countries, because now they never had the chance. They never had the chance to prove themselves. Even if they wanted their money, then even if they can get back their money, they never get, right? So we tell you that the trade-off isn't justified. And thirdly, how it harms why does it harm the developing countries? Because now the rich and the developed countries who already have that money monopolize the state, will monopolize the sports events. Now already the EPL is always in England and things like that. We tell you that let the World Cup, let international sporting event be hosted by the international committee. So we tell you that side opposition further promotes and prioritize the country who actually need their resources and who actually need them to provide better infrastructure and equipment. Thank you.
It's like Luke's speech didn't exist at all for Nicholas today. He specifically told you there was backlash on the ground because people realized the moment you spend a lot of money for the stadiums and the buildings you have, that means that it's impossible for the money to go back to the individuals going there. Because the reason they are developing countries is because they are countries that are scarce of money, which means how did they get the money in the first place? Luke told you they had to go in debt to get all those money. We think that the moment you get back all the tourism money, it's marginal because you have to pay back the debts that you have. You have to fund back the national fund that you had so far on the ground. Luke told you that specifically. Nicholas recharacterized, and it didn't work under their side. But I'll answer two questions in my speech. Number one, what is the development of developing countries and what is the actual impact that goes on? But number two, what is the spending of the money and how it will never benefit the people on the ground? And I'll give you one stat for today, how it's not vested interest of the sports to have it host in developing countries, which much rather have it hosted in developed countries. But let's answer the first question. He told us that, number one, football starts in Brazil. They deserve to be hosted there. We don't think it's a problem because you can still go and represent your countries in another country, developed countries. We think that argument is really weird. But secondly, let's actually assume the best of his argument, but analyze the jobs that can exist. Number twofold, maybe a stadium sweeper or maybe a construction worker in that circumstance when you're building those things. Fine. We think that those things are already characterized to you by Luke. That is temporary. So the benefits that you get on the jobs that you talked about, it's always going to be temporary. We think people are still harmed under those circumstances. When post-World Cup, we think that individuals are still going to be jobless under those scenarios. But thirdly, he talked about tourism. We think tourism is still temporary in a lot of sense because a lot of people coming in, it's fine for this certain scenario. He told us that, but this individuals still have to go back, and the moment the individuals go back, all the money that you accrue, you still have to pay back towards the debt that you owe, and towards paying back for what, how much you spend on the stadiums, how much you spend on the opening ceremony when Shakira has to come in, right? But fourthly, even if there's an influx of economy that he talked about, we think that inflation in the economy is something that's way worse under their side, especially for Brazil, in the instability of the economy that has now. The moment you have inflation, we think individuals on the ground who has jobs now will be harmed and effectively harmed by the inflation that you try to cause under your ground. Because if you think inflation is so good, we don't think that's better for the economy. People on the ground who actually have stable jobs will get affected, and the spillover harms that we would never want to risk under the scenario. But then he also told us and contradicted himself. He said his alternative was Brazil can tax people, Brazil can have really high price tickets, and that's way worse because we think that when other countries, developed countries, can have a reasonable price tickets, you harm Brazil. Because two reasons. Number one, you deter people from coming in because of the high price tickets that you try to put for Brazil just because you want Brazil to get money. But number two, you also harm Brazil's image when when you strengthen the fact that Brazil shouldn't be the country that was hosting the World Cup because of the high price tickets that Nicholas tried to propose. We think that's unnecessary for Brazil to face that backlash and to face the harms accrued to people when individuals propagate the fact that they much rather watch it on TV than the high price that you talked about, right? But also, what is the marginal benefit for developed countries? He said that there's gonna be a monopoly. We don't think so. Number one, it's an assumption because we think that when developed countries hold it, they have the capacity to do so, and it's just a monopoly. We much rather have that monopoly. We don't understand the monopoly because different countries host it every few years, so we don't think it's a problem. But even if it's a monopoly, we much rather have it because nobody is harmed in this scenario. We don't think people are effectively harmed, people are systematically harmed when they're scrutinized for the fact they don't have money and the money goes into something else, another avenue and channel to something way worse. We much rather not take that risk. But before we move on, yes.
Like you said, these developed countries are only host the World Cup for the greater form of entertainment. However, developing countries host it because they need the money, they need the economic avenue. Why is that bad?
But that's an assumption. We don't think they earn the money for a lot of reasons. Number one, the money that does come in through tourism have to go back to the debt and pay back the debts that they owe from getting that money. Because you have to admit, ladies and gentlemen, these are developing countries. They didn't have money in the first place. Where they get the $2.1 billion that you characterized to you, it's very questionable. Number two, we also think it's harmful when pre-World Cup, when the moment you have to get the money, when you have to siphon tax money from individuals on the ground, we think the individuals were harmed during this process of gaining the World Cup traction. We think it's extremely important for us to recognize that these harms can accrue before World Cup. So even if we buy into the characterization that they may get some sort of marginal benefit, we also question the fact whether or not this money can go back to the individuals on the ground or whether it will necessarily be spent on more other unnecessary things. We think that the state needs to be set straight on what the priority is now. The priority is healthcare, the priority is getting people jobs, the priorities is the people on the ground, the secluded areas and the poorer areas. We do not want these marginal things to happen anymore. But secondly, what is spending of the money? Number one, his response to our case that people can have back the money. No, that's not engaging with what Luke said. We already characterized you. Number one, there could be a high possibility of borrowing money from other countries, your allies and whatnot. But secondly, we also think it could be siphoning from high tax. We think that individuals on the ground still get harmed. But also, we think that the money you get back also to be paid back, we don't think it's directly engaging with what we told you, But thirdly, even if individuals get jobs under this scenario, we always think it's temporary. We don't think it's necessarily true that these individuals will get any benefit at all. So yes, step.
The reason why people scrutinize the countries that bid to become the next host of the World Cup is because FIFA is the one that gives them the money to build these stadiums and things like that. So why are they so in debt in your paradigm?
We don't think so. That's not true. We think these countries who bid to host the World Cup have to prove the fact that they can get the money by themselves. We don't think World Cup has a vested interest in giving you that money. That's why you have to bid, Deborah. We don't think you understand sport in that certain scenario. But also, we think that when Brazil proved their capacity, we also told you under Luke's speech that when Brazil could prove their capacity to get the money for the stadium, we think that Brazil also proved to people on the ground that we have the capacity to fund you back. But they largely ignored the fact that we could necessarily fund you in those scenarios and could solve the poverty that was going on the ground. We think that individuals would be systematically harmed and systematically feel shame the fact that their country had the capacity to do so but didn't want to do so. We also think that these individuals deserve those jobs and we didn't want them to get scrutinized in this way. But number one, what's my assumption for you today? Why it's not even in the vested interest of sports to have developing countries rule it. Number one, Luke characterized there was huge backlash within the stadiums during the building of that time, which means that these people were hindering the progress of building of the stadiums. We think it's extremely harmful under those certain scenarios because the infrastructure could have been prolonged or could have been harmed in these scenarios. We think people also endangered in a certain scenario, and the buildings of the infrastructure was also endangered in a certain scenario. We think that when there's systematic harms towards the building and towards the traction that goes on when you build the stadiums, when you build the infrastructure that goes on for the World Cup, we think that it's not in the vested interest of the World Cup, but it could have had a better infrastructure and a better necessary systematic proving and necessary systematic justifying or even like a better planning out in developed countries where there's no hindrance. We think developed countries, the individuals on the ground, are more than happy to have that because they have stable jobs within their economy. We think they're more than happy to have that greater entertainment for them. But also, we think that in developed countries, it's way different, and the delineation that we draw is number one, people are not backlashing, and we much rather have that in the vested interest of the sport. We think that sport is necessarily hindered when people outside of Brazil protest during World Cup and necessarily didn't want that World Cup to be hosted. We think individuals were hindering the people, hindering tourism to come in, and when tourists are directly attacked by these individuals who are unhappy, we are go inside opening government.
Thanks, Deputy Prime Minister, for remarks about long stepping into the opposition.
The procedure to choose someone to host the World Cup or the Olympics is that after the voting system, the country can still choose to say yes or to say no towards this. This proves that the country knows whether it is capable or not to host the World Cup or not, and proves whether the country is capable or not to host the Olympics. If Brazil sees that the World Cup can bring lots of benefits towards its country, then why do you want to shut down the opportunity for Brazil to make that opportunity happen? You shut down these underdeveloped countries from being more developed, and you shut down these developing countries to be a one state they want to be. We think this is a harm coming from their side, something that they will never prove at the very end of the day. There are three things that we want to prove to this debate. Number one, we already proved to you why is it the right of the country to say yes, whether they want to host the World Cup event or not. Secondly, we told you how this will hinder even more problems later on in the future, and we are going to explain why the money income from tourists and so on and so forth can be proved beneficial at the very end of the day. Before I move on to my one and only substantive, few rebuttals. Because what's the big crop of their substantive was that this will create a societal backlash, that Brazil needs to cater towards their people and so on and so forth. Here's the problem within this. Is this really the problem? We say yes, it is a big problem in Brazil, and we need to counter that. Immediately. But if Brazil sees that this is a problem, and the only way for them to cater it is to get tourist income, then why not? We see the same goes in other countries as well, such as Bangkok, for example, where Bangkok sees that only their prostitutes can bring some tourist income towards their country. So if Brazil sees towards this as a whole, if Brazil sees that tourists can bring income to their country, then why not? To make their countries even more economically stable. And then look, give you an example, that South Africa lost a lot of money after the World Cup. This is false. It doesn't work in that way. We think that South Africa gained a lot of money from vuvuzelas alone, that vuvuzela got a world recognition because of that. We don't necessarily think that's true. It is something that also can happen towards Brazil at the very end of the day, where the nature of the sport in Brazil is obviously a good one, and who wouldn't want to watch the World Cup? Who wouldn't want to watch a World Cup where a country has won that World Cup 5 times as a whole? We don't necessarily think there's a really big problem at the very end of the day. We think your side proves a more problem. Secondly, she wants a reasonable price ticket. How funny. We don't think so. They won't put a reasonable price ticket anymore, because we see such as big events, even if you host it in developed countries, such as the London Olympics, they still put their price tickets high because they still want to get money at the very end of the day. In this circumstance, sit down there. In this circumstance, Brazil has to put their ticket prices high because they want that money. Your side and your policy disallows them from making that money go up towards their criteria. If they want to put their ticket prices high, then why not? Why do you want to stop the opportunity for them to get that source of income at the very end of the day? We think that's something really harmful, something that they need to prove in something that they can't prove anymore. Secondly, the prioritization. This is another substantive come from their side. They say that the Brazil needs to prioritize the people towards society and towards their education fare and towards their medical fare as well. We don't necessarily think that's a really big problem, because number one, if Brazil sees if Brazil sees that they can fund back towards the society by the World Cup, then why not? We don't say no towards them at the very end of the day. Secondly, we see a lack of analyzation under their side, because they didn't prove to us how, if Brazil didn't host the World Cup, how does that money go back to society at the very end of the day? We see that Nicholas gave few examples, such as when you build stadiums, you still can use it at the very end of the day. It is a long-term benefit, because those stadiums don't just stand there for one World Cup event, it stands there forever. People can use it numerous times, and obviously Brazil is going to host the next Olympics, where they're going to be using that stadium again. We don't see there's something problem in this scenario, because these stadiums are forever going to be there. It's not destructible. You can still bring it there. It's a societal benefit, something that benefits to society every day. My one substantive on how you shift the beauty of the sport if you make it be in developed countries. But before I move on, yes.
Why not let Brazil invest in long-lasting tourism instead of the temporary one you want to invest in?
We say that, okay, if you want to host it in that way, we say that a World Cup, although it's short term, it brings you a lot of money because it has international recognition, where a lot of people from other countries will come into your country and start watching the World Cup. World Cup is one of the biggest footballing events. Who wouldn't want to watch it? And obviously when it's hosted in a country where it's so famous because of football, so famous because of the most top scorer in the world, Pelé, who wouldn't want to come to Brazil to watch the World Cup at the very end of the day? We think you don't understand anything about football, please keep quiet. Secondly, how you shift the beauty of the sport? Number one, what's the focus of the sport? Obviously the focus of the sport is that the nature of the sport as a whole. That you need to understand how the people play the sport and how you make the sport even more better as a whole. Secondly, what does their policy do? You shift the attention of the beauty of the sport to the beauty of the country as a whole. We see that coming several times in the London Olympics. People, it might have been a good, it was a good event at the end of the day, but what happened? What was the main focus of the fans that went there at the end of the day? They shifted the focus on how beautiful was London at the end of the day. They didn't really shifted the focus on how beautiful the sport was at the end of the day. We think it's a problem that they will fight for, because people will be going to London because they love London, but they're not going to London because they want to support whatever team they want to support. We think it's another problem that they won't be able to solve. So why is this harmful? Because it contradicts the principle of the sport as a whole, that they won't side for a country where people will support, where people will like sports even more. And secondly, what's more worse, you allow the rich to be more richer and you allow the poor to be more poorer. If the people who are rich wants to be rich, then the people that are London, for countries like England, for example, where they already have money at the very day, you want that countries to host sporting events. What happens then? They will get source of income, they have excessive source of income, they'll be even more richer every day. How does that benefit towards countries that don't really have money, and that money can be proved to be a really big benefit towards your country every day? What happens then if it comes towards countries like Brazil? If you don't allow them to host sporting events, you allow them to forever be poor, and you allow them forever to not get that money. We see that's something that's happening inside the 2010 World Cup, where South Africa sold lots of vuvuzelas towards all the people that actually came to watch the World Cup. They got lots of money because of that, and because of that, it was a tourist income that people actually enjoyed blowing the vuvuzela, and then that's how they got the money. It works the same way as Brazil. When people actually come to watch the sport at the end of the day, they still can get that source of income. You shouldn't make it a reasonable price ticket for everyone at the end of the day. We don't actually think that should be a problem. In conclusion to this point, is that you shift the beauty to the sport towards the country, and you don't really shift the beauty to the sport as a whole. We think that's something harmful, something that they will never realize at the end of the day. So what did side opening opposition prove you today? We have told you that that the country always has the right to say no and yes, that the procedure for you to elect that country at the end of the day, you still have that opportunity for you to say yes or to say no towards that bidding process. And secondly, we also prove to you how this societal benefit towards how you get tourist income can get back to society. It's not really a big harm. Your side doesn't solve anything. Thank you.
Two unique extensions coming out from side closing government today. Firstly, on the idea on tourism that they wanted to talk about, make it the biggest matter in it, how we further encourage tourism under our side. Secondly, I'm going to draw you the comparison between developed nations and underdeveloped or developing nations, and how is it much more beneficial under our side, and prove to you how the monopolization of the sporting events from the developed nations that they wanted to talk about will not ever happen under our side. But before that, a few rebuttals. Side opening opposition is willing to live in a world where stadiums are built there. After the World Cup, after the certain Olympics that they wanted to talk about, the stadiums are just left there to rot. That's when there's no direct benefit towards the people on the ground also. We think that majority of people in Brazil, in India, when Thomas Cup is held there also, people on the ground is suffering from poverty already. We see that we don't see how the stadiums can even have a direct benefit towards the people on the ground that has poverty already. And even if they want to talk about the certain sporting events they can hold in the stadium itself, we don't see how they can elevate poverty as a whole. Because what's more important? Let's draw the comparison. Healthcare, education, or do you want sporting? We see that healthcare and education, it's much more important. These are the primary rights that you should have as a certain individual in the nation itself. When you yourself in poverty, when you are already in poverty and you don't have these certain forms of basics right already, we don't see how the stadiums will benefit you in the future also. But secondly, on the idea on hinder of development, that's actually what's happening in status quo now. When people, when states, or when the people, individuals on the ground are already suffering from poverty, when they don't have proper infrastructures to live in, when they don't have healthcare, and the state still focus on the money on building stadiums instead of developing the countries to progress the people, that's when you further hinder the development. Because what we try to fight for is this, that Brazils get their money from debts, right? That's when they have debts. So the profit that they wanted to talk about is marginal under their side. So we don't see how people will get a direct benefit on it also. But thirdly, on the idea on how developed countries will monopolize the sporting as a whole. Mr. Speaker, we completely disagree with this idea. Why so? Because this is something that is short term. Now, when Brazil is able to develop the country properly under our side, that's when they can hold the sporting events, the Thomas Cup, Olympics, and etc. When they are developed already, we don't see how developed countries will continuously monopolize the certain sporting events. But fourthly, how ticket prices will be high, how inflation will happen under their side. That happens under their side, right? Because when the ticket prices are high, that's when the states get the profit from it. But even if there's a profit, we tell that that profit is something that is marginal under their side. Because when they get that certain profit, they still have to repay the certain debts that they have in debt with other countries. That's when the profit is marginalized. But fifth, on the idea on how individuals going to London just to enjoy the scenery. No, we said that's okay, because if the certain individuals want to go and enjoy the scenery in London, we're okay with that. But secondly, we don't see how it violates the principles of football that they wanted to talk about, because we see that there's still check and balance there. Individuals that want to go and support the certain sporting events that's happening in London will also still continuously support the events. We see that there's a check and balance. We don't see how that's harmful on the outside. But lastly, on the idea on how you enlarge the rich and poor gap, that happens under their side, when people are continuously put in a situation where they don't have proper healthcare, they don't have proper education, and they can't self-actualize. That happens under their paradigm only. Whereas under our paradigm, when we allow these certain countries to develop themselves first, when we allow these certain nations, the states, to elevate poverty, then only they hold the sporting events, something we fulfill in the short term and the long term. We see that's much beneficial under our side. But moving on to my extension, how you much benefit tourism. But before that, opening, yes.
Brazil has football league as well, meaning that there are clubs that play at clubs in that country. Why do you want to disallow that to use that stadium that has already been built for the Olympics or the World Cup?
Mr. Speaker, yes, we agree that the stadiums has a short-term benefit to it. For example, if you're holding the World Cup now, you have a benefit towards the nation. But after the World Cup is finished, or after the Olympics has finished, or what they want to talk about, we don't see the direct benefit towards the people on the ground. Even if the people can use the stadium for certain sporting events they want to do in the stadium, we don't see how you elevate poverty under that circumstances also. First level, how their side is just a short term. When they have these certain stadiums built already, yeah, they can attract 1 million or maybe 5 million people towards their stadium in the times where they have the World Cup up there. But after they finish the World Cup, after they finish the certain Olympics that they want to talk about, the people is still suffering. They don't have proper education, they don't have proper healthcare. Certain basic rights are not even given to them, right? It's even harmful. Because when they want to build these certain stadiums, they tear down the nature. And the nature, the certain tropical beaches, is what individuals worldwide, nationwide, is what attracts these certain individuals to go to Brazil to begin with. And when they want to build these certain stadiums, which just serve as a short-term benefit, that's when it's harmful. Because you tear down the major attraction of tourism in Brazil itself. But why is it much more beneficial under our side? Because when we allow this certain development of the nation, when we allow the state to elevate poverty in that certain nation itself first, that's when we allow attraction of tourism to come in. That's when more tourists that's when more tourists are attracted to come into Brazil itself. But there's a distinctive difference, because when we want to tear down the certain nature for development, we tell these certain infrastructures that we're going to give to these individuals is something that serves the short-term and long-term benefit. So under their side, they want short-term benefits of infrastructures such as stadiums, whereas under our side, we tear down the nature for infrastructures such as hospitals, such as schools that provide the basic rights, basic necessities for these certain individuals on the ground. That's when it's much beneficial. But secondly, how under our side, when we allow developed nations to hold sporting events, is much better. We see that individuals in developed nations already have stable occupations. They don't need that certain forms of support from government. And even if they need, we tell that they are in the certain forms of minority and people, and they have proper stable occupations, right? But when we look into the case of Brazil, where people don't even have proper healthcare, where people don't even have proper education for them to get the occupation, for them to get the money they need to sustain their lifestyle, that's when it's harmful, because the state is just going to waste all the money into building the stadiums for the short-term benefit, and you're going to allow the people to continuously suffer on the ground. Whereas under our side, we remove that certain short-term benefit for a while, and we allow Brazil to develop themselves first. Brazil or India and etc. Right? When they develop themselves ready, then they are able to get back the benefit. Also, when they develop themselves as a developed nations, where people on the ground are elevated from poverty already, that's when they are able to hold the sporting events also. Monopolization doesn't happen under our paradigm. For all these reasons, go inside closing government. Two extensions coming up from CEO in today's debate. Number one, why is it the incentive of international sporting events to not disenfranchise participation and to make it a global effort to enfranchise countries of other nations, even though they are developing? These are things never coming up from over. Secondly, the idea of interaction of culture and why it's important, especially for these developing countries, to learn from these developed countries in this situation. Before that, a few rebuttals towards CJ's case, and then I'm moving on to OG, right? Firstly, he told you his main argument was encouraging better tourism, and somehow he tied in this idea of rich and poor gap within that, right? Firstly, he never told you, given his characterization that these countries are already poor, where are they getting this funds from to build better infrastructure for these beaches and things of the such, right? At least under our paradigm, there's some form of potential gain from the World Cup or for the international sporting event that has to be held, that we can use to pump back society and things of the such. I'll tie in the other rebuttals towards his speech based on what OG said as well, because it was sort of a same principle and sort of a minor rehash, I guess. But let's tackle OG and CG together. Right? Not catering to the people. That's the main principle, right? And we don't cater to people in healthcare and things of the such. Let's clear up this factual error in the first place, right? Not all the money for hosting these World Cups and things of such does not solely come from donors, right? There's a model fund coming from the organizing committee, or in this certain situation, the World Cup, FIFA, right? We think FIFA provided the model for Brazil, and if the country wants to get loans or donors, that's in addition to those models that's been provided. So the problem with Brazil was not a lack of funds, but a mismanagement of funds, right? We can solve this with better regulation outside, appointing officials to monitor the funds better, right? These are ways we can solve the problem, right? But secondly, they only wanted the base examples in Brazil. Then let's give you a better example, right? In South Africa, the people were thrilled and overjoyed that the nation was holding the World Cup, right? There was no backlash. Instead, there was a social enjoyment, entertainment that can't be quantified in terms of money, right? And we think that's much better for the people on the ground, right? Where they can get that form of enjoyment that cannot be justified in terms of money and things of such. Those are things which are beneficial to people actualizing themselves and feeling happy about certain situations on the ground. No, I'll take you later, right? So secondly, this idea of harm's image of the country, right? We think that the country already knows that they can have their image can be potentially harmed. So obviously they have incentive to brush up its acts, to improve certain infrastructure before it decides to bid for the international sporting event or World Cup. Those are natural checks and balances and incentives to begin with. But even if that's true, right, that it harms the image of the country, we think it's good. It's the scrutiny that will ensure the transfer of funds flow down to people on the ground and prevent the corruption from being impunity, from individuals on the top having impunity, and the corruption remaining for people on top, and then funds remain people on top, and things of the such, right? I'll tackle the idea of vested sporting interest, the vested interest of sport in my argument today, but before that, any POIs? No, okay. So let's tackle this idea of vested interest of the sport. In my argument, right, what is the vested interest of sport? What is the purpose of these sporting events in the first place? Is to be inclusive of all countries, irrespective of political ideologies, irrespective of the economical situation on the ground. Because we don't disenfranchise countries based on those two yardsticks, right? The statute for the International Olympic Committee says that a country cannot be dismissed from participating in the Olympics based on any ideals of of the sort, right? That's why Malaysia can never hold it, because Israel can never come to participate in any international sporting event right here, right? We often ban sporting players from saying, acting, or portraying political gestures, like the anti-Semitic gestures, right? Like when Nicholas Anelka was sacked by his club when he portrayed anti-Semitic gesture. I'll take you after this point, right? So sports are supposed to bring countries together and not disenfranchise them. So how does this system disenfranchise them? Firstly, you destroy the opportunity for developing countries, the ability for them to send good sporting players to those countries forever, right? Because you have to understand, when it's hosted in your home ground, it's easier to get more participation from your team, from sporting players and such. Because it's much more costly to send so many players, even though they have a potential to grow, even though they are good, to other countries, especially in developed countries, where the cost to send those players are so high. But secondly, you deny the fans, people who enjoy the sport, ability to experience it live. And these are fans who make up a huge part of the sport, right? These are fans who often want to await the day that the nation will host the World Cup or Olympics, right? It's often too costly for them to go overseas, right? So they always await the chance for their nation itself to host the World Cup. You deny them that form of entertainment, which isn't even comparable to watching it from TV, right? Those are things which are vastly different, right? So you deny them the active participation in the sport and active investment in the sport itself, right? And that's harmful. I'll take you after this point. You heard me, right? Yeah, okay. So thirdly, when you don't allow a country to host the international sporting event, there's an active discrimination and delegitimization towards the way the country can play that sport, right? Why is this so? Like, touch a bit upon this, but I'm going to extend it further, right? The World Cup often goes back to Brazil because of its contribution to football and because the roots of football are so deeply entrenched within Brazil. When you don't allow it to be held in Brazil, you destroy and disregard the historical roots and the parts of their contribution towards that sport, right? So we often give countries the right to host these sporting events as a reward for their contribution towards the sport for the past few years, even though they're still developing, right? And those are situations which we must recognize and must legitimize and must reward, right? Because the contribution to the sport is much more substantial towards certain monetary profits or monetary benefit to the quality of the sport, given that they are held in developed countries, right? Those are things you must reward and not disregard. But before I move on, yes.
Basically, your argument is let's give more benefits to the rich Brazilian football club. Let's ignore other people.
No, why? We are not wrong people. People want to see the World Cup in their country. People want to have active investment and participation in the World Cup. You are denying their participation. You are denying sports players their dreams to participate in the World Cup. When you deny them from going to other countries because it's too costly and they can only send the best of the best and not people who have potential to grow young and growing players, right? Those are things that you deny on your side, right? So this active participation, denial of participation will exist forever because it's a great incentive for first world countries to continue keeping the ability to host this World Cup within their class of countries, right? Because of the things that they said, like, oh, you know, there's social backlash and things of such. So we don't want it to be held in other countries. So this entrenches the superiority within these first world nations where they didn't even contribute towards the sport in the first place, right? Those are things that are harmful and those are things which are contradictory towards the principles of the sport to begin with. No, I'll take one closing. Yeah, sure.
Allow the fans, the rich fans of football to enjoy certain World Cup, but you want individuals that are in poverty to suffer as well.
No, why will they suffer? You see, I already characterized you as the problem of mismanagement of funds on your side, not a problem of lack of funds, right? We think that OO already gave ideas that how better tourism can occur. We are going on a different level, right? On how social enjoyment is also important, how individuals on the ground must feel entertained as well and have an active participation in the sporting events that their country is so deeply entrenched in. Those are things that are important that you never understood from your side. So last idea, the interaction of culture, right? Developed nations have certain legal or principle frameworks to protect minorities or to protect individuals on the ground. When there's a lot of stories of sports players from all over the world coming to these developing nations, they interact with the people on the ground, right? It sparks discourse with time of policies and developing and values of these developing nations. And because there's so much scrutiny, right? We think these developing nations who are eager to gain international recognition want to be on the same platform as those developed nations, right? They want to be enfranchised as well. So this discourse is extremely effective, right? Where they will be more willing to be accepting towards those values to improve themselves. When we can legitimately affect people on the ground and challenge their values, these discriminatory things, these ideas of social backlash and poverty can be better solved, right? Where there's more incentive for these countries to improve their acts. There's more scrutiny on them to improve their acts, rather than a blanket dismissal that, oh, just because the country is not hosting World Cup, I shouldn't do anything as well because I'm really delegitimized anyway. It's better on outside to solve these problems. We take this debate.
When people enter the stadiums in Brazil, they see a modern stadium where they can look up to of how the country has built such a beautiful stadium. But when they step out of the stadium, what they see is little children running around the streets. What they see is favelas. What they see is poverty, where the people have nothing to look to. What they see is just a disgust in their eyes when they only see the people suffering. That's all under their side they can see, under their side. Now, over here, what are the issues of my side of the debate, Mr. Speaker? Which side further? Which side furthers the progression of the nation? And secondly, which side has the long-term and short-term benefit? So now, what are the points coming out from side opposition? On their opening opposition side, what have they only explained? The important points of their case was the right of the countries to say yes to host the World Cup, how they hinder development of developing countries, the best for the children of Brazil, which I will rebut later on, and they never give developing countries a chance, and the money they will flow back, and also how they shift attention of the beauty of the sport. And under the member of opposition case, what I got was the vested interest in sport and reverts towards the country. Sit down, I'll take you later. So now, what does side closing opposition prove to you today? So what does side closing government prove to you today? When Ryan came up here today, he talked about tourism. Let me rephrase what I mean by tourism. Well, what is the tourism in Brazil? Brazil is one of the most visited countries in Latin America. What is their source of tourism? Their source of tourism is the Amazon forest, the beauty of the country, the nature in their country, the weather of their country. That is the source of beauty in Brazil. That is how they get the money from Middle China. And on the outside, we've explained that is something long-term to Brazil, because that is what the people of Brazil get every day of their life. That is why people walk into Brazil every day. People go into Brazil every single day because they enjoy that. They do not go to Brazil to look at a stadium which will become a white elephant in 5 years' time. And also, under our side, we have proved to you that under their side, why is it harmful? Because they, under their side, they have used whatever money that the government has in their hands to only build stadiums. But even so, the money they have used could have been used to build hospitals, could have been used to build schools. Even though under our side, even if we have to destroy forests, that we shall say, sit down, we have to destroy forests to build schools and all, we tell you that we destroy the forest for better need, because these schools and hospitals can be used for a lifetime, whereas the stadium only brings waste. Before I head on to the second issue of my side, yes, one of you.
People in Brazil look to play football just to get down their country. Right now, when you go sporting events such as the FIFA World Cup to get attention, why is that harmful?
Look here, we're not saying that the people of Brazil cannot go out and watch football and play football. What we are trying to say is the government of Brazil better off improve the lives of their people first before they go build all these kind of stuff which will bring waste to the country, which I will further explain. And that is why your PI makes no sense in today's debate. And secondly, what is the issue of my side? Secondly, Ryan explained about how the developed countries better off host these international sporting events. Why? Let me rephrase it. Because the people there have stable jobs. People there, we're not saying that every single person there earns big bucks a day, but we are telling you it is a smaller majority of the people. It is a minority which are poor, and it's why when the people have stable jobs, the government doesn't have so much of an incentive. The government doesn't need too much time to dump in money of their people, because their people already have the capability to stand on their 2 feet. That is why we feel that developed countries are better off hosting. Sit down, and we tell you about Brazil. Brazil, what are the people over there? The people there have no proper jobs. Sit down. People there have no healthcare. What do the people have there? What the people have there is favelas to live in, where when it rains, leak of water falls on their head. That is what the people of Brazil have, which we can tell you. But that is what developed countries don't have, and that is why we feel we should host. When the people of Brazil become rich, then they host. That is what we're trying to say. When the people of Brazil are already stable, then they host, because the people benefit from it. Heading to lots and lots of rebuttals and comparison. Before that, yes.
You only assume that there will be the money going back. However, you never told us how. Whereas we told you that the attracted tourists will get back and do this, then the money will circulate. Tell us how does the money that the government gave will go back?
Wonderful. Look here. What source of tourism you have is only for that period of time when they go in. And what happened to the country? The country uses so much money to build the stadium. With the money they gain back from the stadium, they will use that money to pay back the debts of building the stadium. Where do they get the money from? The money goes to waste. But under our side, our form of tourism is every single day of the country's life. And that is why it is more beneficial. Now heading to the rebuttals. Now, what is the leader of opposition brought to you? He talked about how it is best for the children of Brazil. How is it best for the children of Brazil to view football? The people of Brazil. But what's best for the people of Brazil? We see what's best for the people of Brazil. And what is best for the government of Brazil is that the government of Brazil improve their people's life. When they have healthcare, where they put in healthcare for the people of Brazil, where they show, where they improve the lives of their people by providing them the needs of the people, where they develop the people's needs. That is what side government is trying to fight for. But under their side, what are they fighting for? Look what they're fighting for. What their side is talking about, they talk about the pride of Brazil. What we can tell you, what pride Brazil gets over there is that children, when the children go out, they see a beautiful stadium, which is a white elephant, and that is their country's pride under their side. Their country's pride is a stadium, and secondly, what's their other country's pride on their side? Their country's pride is poor people and undeveloped people, where people live in favelas. That is their side of the country's pride, which we see that pride fails, and that is why our pride is better. And in the long term, when they have benefit from it, they can host whatever story that. And before that, yes, closing.
I don't understand why the teachers were all destroyed and Brazil can gain some profit from that as well. It's not mutually exclusive.
So again.
Oh, I don't understand why Brazil has incentive to destroy those tropical rainforests or those beaches that they want to protect if they can gain so much profit from it. So they'll protect it on the outside as well.
Look here, that was an even if statement. What the even if statement was, when you want to destroy, when you pointed out about how you destroy the forest, we tell that if we have to destroy the forest, it's better in the long term because it is something that you can use for a lifetime, unlike your side when you use something that is no longer beneficial. And secondly, he talked about the rights of the country to say yes. Look, we tell you this, every country's right to say yes, but we tell you very well, is every country's right to host, but we feel on the our side that the country only hosts when they have the capability to do so. And secondly, he talked about how they see the beauty of London, how it distracts people. We tell you, under their side, what they do is they want to talk about beauty. Now we tell you what's beauty. We feel that under their side, the only beauty they can see in Rio is the only beauty that the peoples live in favela, where the children run around the streets of Rio without even clothes on. That's the beauty that they can see in Brazil under their side. Now we tell you, heading over to side rebuttals. Now he talked about the rebuttals. Where do you get the funds from? We tell you that in status quo, Brazil had some money already. They had some money to invest into healthcare. But what did the money they used to? The little sum of money they used. They used that little sum of money they had to use it for the World Cup when they could improve the lives of people. And he talked about how sports are supposed to bring countries together. But we tell you under your side, what have you done to the country? What you do is hinder the relationship between the rich and poor of the people of Brazil. And what you have done is only hinder the government relationships with the people because they didn't even help the people at all. That is why we feel the side closing opposition takes today's debate. And if you want the people to improve the lives of the people, we tell you that side opposition takes today's debate.
There was a false dichotomy presented to you by the entire opposition bench today when they assumed that you either get basic rights for people on the ground or you get a sporting event. We reject that premise because we think that in developing nations, already there is a lack of money, right? Something that the entire opposition bench has conceded to. If what they're trying to say is you have to wait for them to get rich, you have to wait for people to get jobs, otherwise they'll be angry, how are they changing it in any way? At least when you get to build these stadiums, you provide jobs for people, right? And we reject the premise also that this is no long-term benefit. We think that there are a lot of tours, right? Tour guides, in fact, specific websites set up for you, for people who are hardcore fans, to tour, fly to every single country that ever hosted the World Cup. They go into these stadiums, they take pictures there, they wear shirts there, and they say, hey, look at me, I'm kicking a ball in this stadium where some kind of famous footballer, I don't know the name of, has played before, okay? We think that there are a lot of long-term benefits that come with these kinds of things, and even if it were short-term, we think that ultimately injecting so much money into the market at this point in time is important for these countries. There's three issues we'll talk about today. Firstly, we'll talk about the importance of international events. We'll talk secondly on the idea of better infrastructure coming from closing Gulf, and then we'll talk about debts and backlash coming from opening up. Let's look at the first idea on the importance of international events, because I think I presented you two extensions which were never dealt with by Chris, right? What were they? First, he talked to you about the principles of international events, right? Why you can't disenfranchise these developing nations. He told you, right, that these are the statutes of the team, right? That host countries have to be inclusive. And the answer he gave you were threefold, right? That firstly, these countries who are poorer just generally cannot afford to send their teams. But secondly, they can't afford to send their people on the ground. But most importantly, right, it's that, you know, the trickle downs that you could have from people working these kind of things, people who sell food at the stadiums, people who could be in construction, people who could make hotels else that people in the future will want even to come in here don't get to benefit these things. And the conclusion to his argument was this, right? That you need to be inclusive because it's an international event, not a first world sporting event. This is something for everybody to enjoy, and this is the principles of FIFA, right? But what is the second idea, right? On the interaction between countries. No, thank you. We think that we give you here's an example, right, of interaction and the scrutiny that can come from when you host an international sporting event. Let's take a look at Russia. They hosted the Winter Olympics, right, and they had horribly homophobic laws, right, but because they were holding this international sporting event, that's how the international community was able to put so much pressure upon them. But the difference between Russia and these developing nations is this: Russia is already developed. They aren't as affected by this pressure as they are, right? Because we can see, right, from countries like Brazil, these developing nations, they are eager to gain international recognition, as Evan told you. They are eager to gain the approval from the international platform because that's something they really need to boost their economy, right? Which is why we think that this pressure is good, right? To gain the kinds of legal frameworks that you need to protect the rights of the minorities in these countries. We didn't get any engagement upon that, and all right, I guess that it stands. But let's look at the second idea on better infrastructure coming from Ryan. A little bit of a rehash, but never mind. Let's deal with it anyway. Because basically he told you this. Somehow tourism is better because you get infrastructure like hospitals and schools. Apart from that, we don't know where they're getting that money, because the money that Brazil is getting now is because not only FIFA is funding them, but because it's a reason for FDI to come in. FDI doesn't come in because they want Brazil to make hospitals and schools. It's because they want Brazil to host an incredible World Cup. That's the kind of funds the opposition bench will never get, right? But assuming they can build these kinds of things, is that really what people usually go on holiday for? To see Brazil's hospitals, to see Brazil's schools? We don't think so. People go to Brazil because they want to take pictures in the stadium and pretend they're playing ball there, right? But let's look at the last idea, on the idea of debts and backlash. But before I move on, that's that.
If your benefits and harm lies on Brazilian football, which is basically your extension, compared to us, the poor people on the ground get marginalized, I'd much rather prioritize my arguments.
Oh, but the thing is, the poor people aren't getting marginalized. Who's going to work all those jobs in the stadium? Who's going to work the jobs of, bringing these people around? It's the people on the ground, right? So let's take a look then at the last issue on debts and backlash. Let's explain a little something. This money here is not coming from a siphoning of money from the people. No, thank you. If I take any POS at this point, it'll be from closing. Now, we don't think that these countries are siphoning money off the people, right? Because it's usually coming from FIFA and other things. But even if it is on loan, we think that the loan only comes because they're hosting an international sporting event, right? This money doesn't come any other way, and Brazil or other developing nations would never get this money or such a big amount of money anyway. But let's look at the second level, right? On the idea of debts. We think that there's a natural check and balance for these governments, right? When they put forward these proposals, when they accept the bid, right? We don't think that they're necessarily going to accept it if it goes at the expense of their people, right? If their people really die, if they're really siphoning money of the people, because it's a natural check and balance of that they'll be voted out in the next term, right? Because people generally don't want to keep governments in that make them die every time a World Cup comes in, right? We think that it's pretty long term actually, a decision, because a lot of the time we understand, right? Countries make decisions but taking into account a lot of different levels, right? And people on the ground don't necessarily see these levels. We think that these countries do. But let's look at but like even if there is some kind of backlash, we think that this backlash is only something that it's subjective, right? It depends on the countries that you're talking about. South Africa loved it. We think that Brazil, to some extent, they are loving it to some extent. But let's look at this second idea, on the idea of how there are no tangible benefits post-game and during game somehow. But look, we think that there are, right? Because you're not just building stadiums, even though I already told you why stadiums are useful in the long term. Right. You're building things like resorts, hotels, right? You're also doing things like on break days from the football, you're giving like tours to people to go around the forest, things like that, right? And because of these kinds of things, the balance is this, that Brazil uses the FIFA money and Brazilian workers to gain profits as a host. And these profits are things that Brazil would never have gotten any other way, right? And that's the incentive, right, for these hosts to be on their best behavior. I'm directly tackling with Deb's idea on how you give a bad perception upon Brazil or these countries, right? Because they have that, because of the international scrutiny that Evan talked to you about, that's the incentive for them to do their very best, right? To maximize the kinds of funds that they can talk about. If the problem that Evan talked to you about, right, the mismanagement of fund is there, we think that's something that we can always try to work together with as an international cooperation, something that only exists in our side. But let's look at the last idea of inflation somehow, right? Here, let's talk about the market, right? How things work. We don't think inflation necessarily exists, right? Because here's how it goes, right? When there's more money in the market, when you bring more people into the market, that's when more people spend. When more people spend, you get more people earning more money, right? And when more people earn money, Brazilians on the ground, they get more money in general. This is how that flow trickles down, right? We don't think that there'll be an inflation. We don't think that there'll be some kind of, harm towards the people then taking their money away. In fact, we think that when so many viewers, spectators
come in, so many footballers come into these countries, that's when the money stays in that country. That's when the country is able to use this money to create the kinds of hospitals, schools, electricity, flowing water that opposition wanted but could never afford, because Brazil's not going to be able to get such FDI anyway. Thank you.